Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Council meeting follow-up. We got anything on that, Carter? Or any council members for that fact?
I really don't, Mr. Mayor.
Okay.
I think
Does anybody have anything from last week's meeting? Okay. Going on to the next, community promotions process changes. Go ahead, Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. Good evening. It's good to be with you tonight. We have an opportunity to rethink a process and program that's been in the city's midst for quite a few years. In fact, as I was mentioning to some of you earlier, when I was here right out of graduate school, one of my assignments was to help manage that program. And frankly, community promotions was funded in a much more significant way back in those days than it is today. The opportunity that I'm suggesting we take tonight is the opportunity to reimagine this program with regard to some of the frustrations that council has expressed to me over the years and finding a way to get through that in a little more effective and efficient way, particularly if we can partner with a partner who's willing to bring some cash to the table and help fund the program a little more appropriately, and in a manner that brings a lot more analysis to the table as well, and brings some expertise to the table that council could enjoy and appreciate, and do it in such a way that doesn't take as much of council's time either in the meantime. The partnership that I'm suggesting, that you probably already read about in your packet, is with regard to partnering with Visit Casper, who is willing to bring some cash to the table, and as a matter of fact, funds very similar requests as well, almost in duplicative fashion, if you will. We're hoping that with your blessing and with your discussion and thought and everything else, we can create almost like a third party that would be made up of representatives of your group and representatives of Visit Casper to evaluate the same programs that would potentially bring people into the community like you're familiar with on a manner that's much more thorough, much more consistent, and also in a manner that doesn't obligate cash from the city, but rather in-kind support, which is where the city can be probably most effective in a partnership of this nature, and allow Visit Casper to provide the cash portion, if you will, for those programs that are successful. And so with that, we have the opportunity to streamline your time involved in this process, deploy the right expertise with regard to each entity's lane, so to speak, and hopefully support the programs that need that support, that bring people into the community in a manner that is, the most effective that we can possibly imagine, if you will, in an idea like this. The timing is really good, particularly for the city, since it would be right about now that we would start asking for your blessing to send out applications and start generating interest among the programs and entities that typically have interest in this type of a opportunity. So, Mr. Mayor, that really is the idea. We do have Visit Casper here tonight to help answer questions and get your thoughts, get your input. If we have homework we need to do, we can do that. But the reality is there are some of you who have had the opportunity to bring this idea forward as well, and I look forward to entertaining any of that input also if it is appropriate to do so. Thank you.
So I'll open the floor up, and I know there are a couple comments, and I know Amber had some thoughts and questions and some comments. So go ahead, Amber.
Thank you, and thanks so much for including it on the work session tonight. This, I don't know if I brought this idea, but it came out of a number of people's discussions after our experience doing community promotions process last time. And as I was going through that process, I was thinking pretty much the whole time that I felt like I was duplicating efforts of an entity that already exists in town when we're talking about which of these events I'm trying to weigh, which of these events is going to have the most impact on Casper, which of these events are going to result in more overnight stays, which of these events are going to be the most bang for our buck in terms of what money we're putting behind them. And it just seemed, I felt not really the best person to be answering those questions. And so it seemed to me that we do already have an organization that we have a great working relationship with that does that every day, all day, as their primary function. And so it seemed to me that we might be better served by trying to amplify some of those efforts with the budget that we do have for these events, rather than trying to recreate the wheel and create our own program. And so I think that what we came up with is makes a lot more sense to me. It leverages city assets like facilities and services to help Visit Casper bring in the types of events that they have already identified would be the most impactful to our community, and just leverages our assets without us having to outlay any cash, which I think makes more sense as well. Strikes me as a little bit odd that we inject cash specifically into some of these events, rather than just using the different support mechanisms that we have to make them work without directly drawing down on the general fund. So to me, I think this makes a lot of sense. Looking forward to hearing what you all think of where we've landed with this. But yeah, thanks for hearing it out today and for getting it on the session.
Questions? Yeah, Bruce.
Sorry, my only question would be, what are the cons? I didn't see any. So, I mean, budgetarily, is it going to create maintenance issues? I just didn't see anything like that in here. And so, just looking at it, it's like win-win-win all the way. But surely I think it's been thought of on both ends. So I thought that should probably be shared with us at some point.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, thank you for the question. The downside that some may view as a downside, I'm not saying this would be a universally accepted downside, would be that council would have less control in the outcome as it relates to who gets funding and who doesn't, and how much, and that kind of thing. Because basically what would happen is this board that you would help appoint would do all the filtration for you and the analysis, and then present through your appointees a recommendation for you to adopt, basically unilaterally, if you're able to do that, without having had all of the experience of running through the applications, looking at the spreadsheets, evaluating the overnight stays, and having that level of involvement like you have historically. Now, again, to me, that's an advantage with respect to doing it this way, because it streamlines your time and involvement and analysis, if you will. Some, however, would view that as a downside, I guess.
I certainly don't. And as a follow-up, I would just ask, this isn't going to put us in any type of we don't have to put out a, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, thank you. We're not circumventing other folks by doing this, right? I mean, we're within our legal recourse to do this, and without putting a RFP out for it. Thank you. I got Amber with me tonight. I just want to make sure we're not overstepping, you know what I mean? And I'm sure you've thought of that.
Mr. Mayor and Council, I don't think so, because basically your application process was your RFP process, if you will. And you're essentially outsourcing that also to this board. But the advantage you have is you'll have a couple of your own who are participating in that process, and they basically are your emissary with regard to things that they may think is inappropriate or wrong or not acceptable. And the fact is also, if you wanted to look at this from a pilot year standpoint to see how it works, and then maybe reevaluate it again next season, you certainly have that option as well. But you get to name the budget, you get to say yay or nay, and you also get the advantage of not having to be as involved if you don't want to be.
Well, I like it. I just wanted to make sure we had all the everything on the table. But I do agree with you. If you were actually, I'll just say I agree with your statement that I think it should be probably reevaluated next year, I guess, to make sure that it's working for us the way we wanted it to. I always think that's a good idea.
Lisa?
So am I to assume that then Visit Casper is going to come and give us a report of, here's the organizations that we awarded da-da-da to, and then do we get a follow-up at the end of the season to see, like, how well they performed? Yes, Brooke is,
I was just waiting for the right time. Mayor, members of council, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight. That's a great point, Lisa, because we would do it once a year, so yes. So right now, how we do it at Visit Casper is we deploy the funds. We don't pay until the event is over, and then with that is reporting and how many hotel nights it generated. So council would be able to have that full report combined, same as our board would request that as well. So it would be a once-a-year report out that said this was the impact of the dollars we deployed. Mayor, if I can just take a liberty quickly, one of the neat things about this, as we've explored this option, is we typically give grant money to offset venue costs in the city. So when you look at the nearly $200,000 a year that Visit Casper allocates to grant funding, a large percentage of that is because people are having a hard time paying for facilities for their event. So what's neat about this partnership is that you have the facilities and the services, and we do allocate the money so that we can make those dollars or those resources go farther and solve more problems. So I feel like in that regard, it is a really good partnership, because instead of us saying we're going to continue to pay for these things, the city can just come to the table and maybe reduce the cash burden. So good question, Lisa. Thank you.
Anything else for Brooke while she's up? Oh, let me get Kyle, and then we'll move. Sorry, hold on, Brooke. Go ahead, Kyle.
Thanks, Mayor, and thank you, Brooke, for being here to answer questions and for your interest in Visit Casper partnering with us. When we were talking about community promotions last year, I was thinking a lot about, I certainly disagree well, I would agree with my colleagues that we shouldn't be giving any cash, but even the contribution of facilities, I don't know. It makes me wonder how appropriate it is when we're struggling to fund so many other things, considering the 5 city amenities now, the rec center, Fort Casper, the event center, Hogadon, and I'm missing the other one. But we spend about $3 million a year subsidizing those facilities. And so I guess for me, I just wonder, is it appropriate for us to be contributing anything towards these sorts of things? And so I guess my question to you, Brooke, would be, what do you see the value in, I guess I'd like to learn a little bit more about the grants you just talked to, about how you get those grants and how you expend those grants, and what value you think this partnership could have towards, you mentioned economic impact, so maybe that's what it is, overnight stays and stuff, but what other value do you see this partnership having? Thank you.
So I think a good example of this, Councilman Gamroth, would be the volleyball and the basketball tournaments that are held at your rec center. So typically every year, Visit Casper writes a check for those tournaments directly to that facility for $10,000. When you run the economic impact numbers of those tournaments, they bring in hundreds of teams and kids and families for the weekend. It's $900 and some odd thousand for each event. So I think the return on that, like whatever it takes for them to be able to host those tournaments, is very important to us. So I think sometimes it's hard to look at that cold hard cash on the subsidy and say this is worth it, but I look at the impact of these things that wouldn't be able to happen if, for example, AAU volleyball, they're renting every gym in town, their gym costs are $6,000, right? So that's a small fee based on the return, but if we can't help them close the gap to host the event, then we're not going to see any return. So, and then you asked me also another question about, so the money comes from lodging tax dollars. So we're able to use those if there are events that drive overnight stays. So several years ago when this conversation started, the city also, one of the, I guess, primary mechanisms or things you're trying to achieve with your money is also bringing overnight stays and to drive growth in your economy. So we want the same things. We just have mechanisms in place to be able to measure these things, and we want to be able to share that with you. So it's all lodging tax funds. It's not, we don't go apply for grants to then turn around and give money away. It's dollars that come in that way.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Brooke. My follow-up question is, what sort, so you mentioned volleyball. I imagine sports tournaments and stuff is high priority for the Visitors Bureau. Do you have criteria that you would be, I know we have certain criteria for our community promotions And I believe they were heavily based around the idea of economic development. And so that was an issue I had last year with our distribution of community promotion funds. Was I felt like several of those events, it would be very hard to make a case that there was any sort of economic development involved. And so I'd be curious to know what criteria or what sorts of events are you guys thinking from the Visitors Bureau that would be ideal for this sort of promotion? When I looked at, I believe we got all the P&L statements for the events that we contributed towards last year, and I remember seeing several of them. They did very well as far as profit goes, and so when an event makes $30,000 in profit, I wonder, why is the city donating any in-kind? They could afford that. And so if you could speak that, you mentioned sporting tournaments not being able to potentially host tournaments because they can't reach that. Are those the sorts of events that you would be targeting, or that's the end of my question. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Councilman Gamroth. So I would say right now 70 to 80% of our money is deployed around that, because a lot of it does go towards the facilities rent. But we're able to fund a lot of different things, but it's all tied back to, does it drive overnight stays? So right now our criteria is actually very stringent. It depends on seasonality. It depends on if the event is likely to return, how sustainable the event is, does it drive overnight stays, how much lodging tax does it generate? So there's 9 or 10 things that, as the board now looks at those applications, says this is how it's ranked in these categories so that we can make that decision. So, but again, I think in a partnership, we'd have to work really close with you guys to say, what if there's things that you want to see evolve or the process morph a little bit to fit some of the things of the city, then I think it's a co-effort, right? And we're certainly open to that.
Amber.
In response to Councilman Gamroth's points, that you're articulating a lot of the frustrations that I had going through the first process, where I felt like we had almost no way or very little way to truly quantify or understand the impact and success of that program. And so it made me feel ill-equipped to be making decisions if I have no real way to understand, was it successful, did it generate the types of impact that we were wanting to see? And that's another reason I like this opportunity for partnership, is Visit Casper has really sophisticated tools that we don't have, and we certainly are not getting the type of analytics that we could get through this partnership in terms of what the real impact is, so that we know if our strategy is, if these dollars are being useful for our community, or if they're really not. And so I think I share your frustrations with the way that the process has worked in the past, and I think especially from the impact and the sort of data side of it, I think that this arrangement is going to be significant, and it's significant improvement over what we have right now.
Anybody else have questions for Carter? Oh, Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think one of the things, too, to kind of key off of the points that are being made here, one of the other things that Ms. Kaufman and I have talked about, and Mr. Farley and I have talked about, are with regard to what really should be the role of Advanced Casper in all this, because they, too, get pulled into some of these requests as well. We're hopeful that with this process, Advanced Casper doesn't have to deal with these kinds of questions anymore. All those types of proposals and activities and events will come through this board instead, of which Advanced Casper would not participate. And then that way, the dollars and cents that they get and that they develop and put together and so forth are dedicated more towards economic development efforts and not economic impact efforts, which in my opinion are two dramatically different things. Hopefully this board would be economic impact focused, and Mr. Farley's efforts and groups and so on will be dedicated strictly to economic development from now on.
Anything else from anybody? So, I mean, I'm just going to weigh in really quick. I think this, Amber did have a kind of give this a little bit of a conversation where she brought it up and said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And utilizing our assets as a city, and then utilizing Visit Casper to do this is a smart way. I think it's cleaner, and it gives us more of an opportunity to do that. I've been doing community promotions for almost 8 years, and every year it just seems like, you know, you get more and more to a point where you're just like, well, I got to let it add up to 25,000 at the end, what we were doing, and it just doesn't, it's not effective. I think this is a much better way to do this, and so I'm full support of it, so. Anybody else? Yeah. Oh. Amber.
I did want to ask a question. I know that we, as we were having preliminary discussions about this, we talked about, you know, when we're thinking about services versus facilities, those things have different levels of hard costs associated with them. And we did talk about what the appropriate way to account for the hard costs in the general fund would be versus the not hard costs in the general fund. And I know that you were possibly going to talk to Jill about that, or do we have a plan for that? Do we need to set, we talked about setting maybe, you know, out of whatever we allocate, we're willing to give this much towards facilities and this much towards services. Do you need that level of detail from this conversation tonight so we can move forward?
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Pollack, I think that is very important for us. I don't know that we need to make that decision this evening necessarily, unless council's ready to do that. Without a doubt, the categories of costs that I'm concerned about are certainly with respect to what our true out-of-pockets are to support an event. And generally speaking, that would be, you know, overtime costs that we incur or direct purchases that we have to incur to support the event, whatever that might be. Those costs that we would probably not incur were it not for the conduct of that event. And then furthermore, council needs to be concerned about, you know, to what level of billing back do we need to be concerned about? In the example that was brought up, if the rec center has an amount of, you know, fees that they would ordinarily assess an event, from an accounting standpoint, it would make sense that we would build those fees into our budget that we would set aside for this kind of a thing. The event center is another good example. Because the reality is, unless council tells us to just waive a fee, which isn't typical, we would build some kind of billing mechanism to a ledger line item that would allow us to pay for whatever that would be. And so you're right. We need to understand what your tolerance is for that level of accounting and keeping up with those costs and making sure we're kept whole, or whether or not you're okay waiving the realization of revenue that otherwise, like at the event center, we would probably get. In the past, you've also been real clear about supporting things on a 50% basis. Does that go away with this type of a program? We're certainly talking about inside baseball right now, but the reality is we do need some kind of direction along those lines eventually so that we know how to appropriately set up the budget for FY23 so that we know those answers ahead of time.
Bruce.
On that line, Carter, you know, I'm all for supporting things like Proud to Host the Best and our Casper Event Center and everything else, but Kyle brought up a really good point. It's really difficult to stomach giving someone opportunities financially for them to make a profit. That's when it becomes difficult. And when Kyle mentioned it, looking at those P&Ls and some of these, you know, we're subsidizing them to the tune of $10,000, $15,000, and they're showing $30,000 profits for their groups. That's pretty hard to stomach from our point of view when we're subsidizing so much already. So I would almost be interested in seeing some type of guideline put in that, yes, we're willing to get behind you and help your event happen, but in the event that there's a profit made, you know, X amount of dollars need to be paid back to the city. This shouldn't be a handout to you and then you make a profit and ride off into the sunset with those dollars. That's inappropriate, in my opinion. So if we could somehow, and I think that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about these lines. So if we could somehow build something into to being paid back those subsidy dollars when they are creating profits on their end, I would feel a lot better by it.
Councilman Nell, just a follow-up question for you then. Would it be appropriate or easier to track if we said, because we asked for P&Ls in advance too, to say where are you at? And at a certain level, I need somebody to like cash flow, right? I need them to be able to have money to buy stuff, but at the same level, we feel the same. So I just wonder if there's a certain amount, like a tolerance that we both have to what they make on an event, and then the rest we wouldn't typically award.
You know, that's a great question, because I do understand in the beginning, the initial subsidy is needed for them to rent the facilities or do whatever, and they don't have that cash flow maybe up front. But I'm worried about on the back end now. Okay, you took our subsidy, you were able to have your tournament. We reap the benefits of it as a community through lodging tax dollars and sales tax and everything else. But you're walking away with a $30,000 lump, and we're still stuck here giving you that taxpayer subsidy. And that's the issue for me. So I don't know what the tolerance would be. Zero. I mean, if you're asking me,
Yeah.
but you know, I'm a business guy, and so I like the ledger to always be balanced. And it doesn't feel good watching anybody profit off of subsidy or taxpayer dollars. The idea doesn't stomach well. So I don't know, Ms. Kaufman, what the answer to that is, but I'll bet we could find some kind of middle ground that would work for all of us, and also still allow us to you know, give these subsidies and have these events, which are very enriching to our community. So there's got to be a balance, but nobody's ever, I don't think, ever held their feet to the fire before either. You know, we've always just kind of let them ride off with their money, and we were just happy to get the sales tax dollars. But I mean, are we being fair to our constituents, I guess, in doing it that way? So.
I think, Councilman Nell, as a follow-up, and Mayor, one of the things too is that we've kind of talked about this first year, and I appreciate that you said 1 year, because Carter said Visit Casper and cash in the same sentence 17 times before I walked up here. I'm like, yeah, let's look at this a year from now. I'm having a heart attack in the audience. But anyways, I do think we're going to have to walk really lightly this first year, right? Because we don't know necessarily all of the answers to everything, but I think somewhere we have to start. So if it is that, and we realize every event's making $35,000, something's got to change, we're going to work through that. So I know that that's probably hard to hear as council. I just would ask for a teeny bit of grace in that, because I don't think we have all the answers yet. It's not anything we've done, so.
Absolutely. And just as a follow-up, if I may, I don't want to hinder anyone that wants to bring an event to our community. I don't want to say, we're not giving you dollars because you're making money. I don't want it to become that. I just want them to share in and be accountable for, hey, wait a minute, we're using taxpayer dollars to help you. Now you're making a profit somewhere in the middle, you know what I mean? So that it works for everybody. And I think that's fair. And so how that happens, I don't know. I'll leave that to the smarter people in the room like you. How's that?
No, me too.
Vice Mayor.
Well, on that note, my biggest thing is I don't want to lose events either, because we're asking them to give money back, because if you lose a $900,000 event to this community of Cheyenne, that's zero that we have and 900,000 somebody else has. So the one question I guess I have, Brooke, is that with us combining onto a board, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of these people go to multiple places for funding. And so would that take some funding? We're basically going to centralize where they're going to get the funding. So I guess with that in mind, I would hate to see us cut this back in any way, just due to the fact that people would come to us and they'd go to several other stops to get the amount of funds that they need. And if they've got one shot at it, I'd rather not cut back what we're offering through the city itself, because that's it. They don't have anywhere else to go.
Mr. Mayor, Mr. Vice Mayor, that's a good question as well. And what I would say is the only real margin that council might be taking off the table is what it is that you give in true cash, true hard cash out of the bank, so to speak. And when you look at what is actually distributed in terms of cash through the community promotions program compared to what you distribute via in-kind services and facilities and whatnot, the cash is a very, very small piece of that whole funding picture. And so I would suggest to you, the groups are not losing that much by the city getting out of the cash business. And in fact, it'll probably be made up, depending on what number you go with, as direction to us, through the in-kind services that they would receive in replacement.
Steve Cathy.
Thank you. Along the lines of community promotions, first of all, I had never been a fan of giving the cash. I didn't feel that that was right at all. Secondly, I was under the impression, having done this several years as well, that community promotions was not supposed to be a fundraiser or a means of funding a fundraiser for the organization, which falls along the lines of Councilman Gamroth's concerns about making a bunch of money off of it. We aren't supposed to be funding fundraisers. That's up to the organization. So I guess I would have to agree with Councilman Gamroth that we need, if they do make a big profit, because it is then becoming a fundraiser, that there needs to be some kind of a clawback clause in our agreement with those organizations.
So Carter, tonight, do you need us to give you a thumbs up for the changes, and then the nuts and bolts come later? Is that what you're looking for?
Mr. Mayor, I think if we at least get direction with regard to the concept we're presenting tonight, we can certainly take whatever homework you would ask to be done forward from here. And if indeed part of that homework is, well, bring us back a number, we can certainly work on that. We would work on that in partnership with Visit Casper, and maybe come to another work session here real soon to say, this is what we think, what do you think, and this is what we anticipate this covering in terms of in-kind services and/or out-of-pocket costs.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, council, what I also heard is, I think what Bruce was saying, what is, what's our limit? Where do we look at that as far as what they're making? Is that something we can look into too? I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Well, Mr. Mayor, my first shot at that would be if there are some rules, so to speak, that you would like to see written into this program, particularly as we're getting into this pilot year of trying this out. I would ask that you think about that, and I'm sure Visit Casper will think about that as well, so that as we get into this, at least from a starting off standpoint, a jumping off standpoint, we have a modicum of understanding of what's important to you, and Ms. Kaufman will have that same understanding of what's important to Visit Casper, and I think between the two agencies, we can at least have a good shot at starting this off. We're going to learn some things over the next year. And we'll come back to you again this time next year and say, hey, here's what we learned. Here's what we were able to invest in. What would you like to see different?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
If I'm right, if I heard you right, your concerns are the same as mine. So it sounds like we're going in the right direction. We just need to try to probably take a year, like Carter said, and just try to meld it all together and figure it all out so that it's a win for the community and for both of our organizations. That's what I'm hearing.
Yes, and I think just a point of clarification, a lot of people host a tournament because it's a fundraiser for their club. Sure. So somewhere in there, we have to figure out what that looks like and say, you're still allowed AAU to make money because we understand you're doing all the work, but what the city or Visit Casper's involvement in is, we need to figure that out. But yes, I think it's going to take the year. I do.
And I get that, and I think Vice Mayor had a great thought on it, because if we start getting too stringent, then Cheyenne or Gillette or somebody else is going to be doing this instead of us. And so it's a very delicate thing, I understand. So good luck. I'm with you.
So Carter, I'll just make the clarification then. We're really going to just get the thumbs up money. I'm moving forward with the, what we're doing, and the board really is going to have to come up with, the nuts and bolts of the process and coming back and talking to us. So is that fair to say? Okay. All right. Okay. So everybody in favor? Okay. All righty. And I think you're next up, Ms. Kaufman. So Visit Casper Bus Partnership. Carter, do you need to tee it up for us?
I'd be happy to, Mr. Mayor. Visit Casper came to us, I don't know, not even a year ago, and said, hey, what do you think about the possibility of helping us to meet a need with respect to a lot of those who visit in our community and need access or the ways to be transported to access the rest of our community while they're here for a convention or a conference or some other event that brings people to town. Visit Casper acknowledges that the city understands the transit business, understands what is appropriate by way of, the type of vehicle to purchase and how to maintain those kinds of vehicles, et cetera. They, however, understand the value of where people want to go and when they want to be there, and what actually we can offer that helps bring more people to the community because this service is available. To give you a real brief, sort of broad stroke on how this partnership lays out, the city has some roles in a potential partnership like this, and Visit Casper would as well. And I'll just give you a quick rundown as I understand it. Visit Casper would actually purchase the bus that we're talking about here, which would be very, very closely akin to what we use in our transit system, okay? Although we wouldn't, of course, be using federal dollars to make purchases like this. Visit Casper would actually pony up those monies. Visit Casper will operate that bus on behalf of the community's efforts in her world and lane, if you will. Visit Casper would provide for the liability coverage. Visit Casper would provide for the major maintenance, engine replacements, God forbid, transmission replacements, et cetera, as well as, the marketing for the service. That could include wrapping the bus in very eye-catching ways, whatever. Marketing the benefit and everything to people that would come to our community. The city, on the other hand, would be responsible for providing the minor maintenance, oil changes, small repairs that occur from time to time that we are very accustomed to doing for our bus fleet. We would actually own the vehicle so that we could cover it on a property coverage basis, which would be very, very minor in terms of our overall property portfolio that we already have to maintain. And that, frankly, would mean quite a bit more to Visit Casper if they had to do that, because they just don't have that presence and footprint like we do. We then also would store the vehicle when the vehicle's not in use, which again is something we do, and we have the space for the accommodations to do on a more routine basis like we do the rest of our other bus fleet. And so from that standpoint, that's basically the breakout as it relates to how Visit Casper would participate and how the city of Casper would participate. I would tell you that our out-of-pocket costs to participate in the way that I just described would be less than $1,000 a year. And so the reality for us in terms of the changing the oil types of responsibilities and those kinds of things, we're really only anticipating in a full year of this partnership being asked to spend less than $1,000 a year. And so from our standpoint, there's not a lot of loss, if you will, to participate in the way I just described. It sounds like what we would gain by having this service available through Visit Casper, and during the times that we need to use it for the rare things that maybe we'd have going on at Hogadon and so on for major events. It sounds like a real win-win from my standpoint. We obviously have Ms. Kaufman here to walk us through any nuances that you'd be interested in from her standpoint. But if you have any questions at all, homework we need to do, that's why we're here.
Good, Brooke.
Mayor, members of council, thank you. I didn't go far. So 5 years ago, when I first took the job at Visit Casper, we saw a need from a transportation perspective. We've never really adequately been able to move conventioneers or visitors around our community. So many of you have participated in events in Cheyenne, and they have trolleys, right? So they've had a trolley program for maybe the last 15 or 20 years where they bought one, it was sustainable, it made a little bit of revenue, they bought the second one. So today, Cheyenne now is able to compete in a way that we cannot when it comes to securing convention business or things that would come to our city. So this is not an attempt to buy a fleet. This is an attempt to say, can we put our toe in the water to start solving the problem of transportation? So we have spent the last 5 years, we set up an independent foundation separate from lodging tax, And every chance that we had to raise money that was separate from the lodging tax went into this savings account because we knew the day would eventually come, and here we are, that we would have enough money to hopefully partner with the city and buy a bus. So today really is about helping solve a need in the community. A good example is we're hosting Outdoor Writers Association of America later, just in May this year. Our transportation costs, we're bringing 5 motor coaches up from Fort Collins, and it costs us $23,000 to do it. So somewhere in here, we have to start finding a solution to our biggest challenges, and this is the first step. So we don't know how to manage fleet. We don't have a place to store it. I mean, you've seen our office at Second and David, good luck. So that's why I'm like, I want the city to do what the city does best, and I want Visit Casper to do what we do best. And together, I think we can do something really amazing to start something. So that's really what this proposal is about tonight, is how do, again, do we create a win-win for everyone? Thank you, Mayor.
Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, Jai.
Thank you. So just in terms of the example you gave, just so that we have kind of the broader vision. So you're bringing up these 5 motor coaches you said from Fort Collins. So would this bus, in theory, replace one of them? Would it replace more than one, or what would be the ultimate goal, I guess, moving forward if this is a stepping stone?
So I don't know if we'll ever own a fleet big enough to handle something like that. So I think at some level, we'll always be a market that has to bring in coaches. But we have very small groups. If it's 50 or 75 people, mostly we're a drive-in market. But there's people who don't want to drive, or they can't move around, or the weather's bad. So it solves a lot of problems even for those smaller groups initially. I know there's actually a lot of groups here in our community that would love to be able to have a bus that they pay for hire. But with the city's restrictions on federal dollars going towards transportation, we just haven't been able to do it, right? So we're always piecing it together, relying on Casper College or the airport or somebody's good graces to be able to help us. So it doesn't solve the 5 motor coach problem, but it's a start.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Kyle.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you again, Brooke. Carter, it sounds like you've already established something like this based on the estimate you gave us of the cost to the city. But I was just personally curious, major repair, how are we defining that? Is that based on parts of the vehicle or cost to repair? Just curious, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that would likely be something we would want to delineate in the MOU that the city and Visit Casper would enter into. Certainly, I think one way to do that would be to delineate a cost threshold that would, substantiate what that means. There's a number of things. Maybe the thing that we could do is just simply identify the things that the city's willing to do versus what they couldn't do. And that would be things like repairing a flat or fixing brakes or doing oil and stuff like that. That might be a more finite list that covers this more effectively. I'm not sure. But without a doubt, we are going to be looking for some level of delineation, so that it's pretty clear that when we all move on to other things and that agreement is the only thing that, captures this understanding, it's helpful versus not real useful.
Bruce.
Thanks. Seems like a good win for us, and we get another asset out of the deal, which I'm quite impressed, and this is where I'm just giving it to you. Your checkbook's open today, and I wanted to thank you for that.
I'll be coming back. I feel like it's got to go both ways. But honestly, we've been saving for a long time. It just happens that this conversation is intersecting today. But really, a 5-year wait to get here has been a big wait.
I'm used to you coming asking, though, and today your checkbook's out. I'm digging it.
We want to be partners. Thank you.
Lisa.
Just curious, how often do you anticipate on using this bus? Just a rough guesstimate.
My hope is 100+ days a year. I mean, I think to start, there's a big need out there. We'll always find a way, even if it's running tours in the summer for leisure visitors, to move them around the city. I don't think we're going to have a problem with that. I know there's a need to get skiers from the base of the mountain up to Hoganon, so potentially there's a relationship with the city. So I would say as much as we can use it, we're going to do it. I don't want it sit in the shop or in the garage.
Vice Mayor.
I guess just to clarify, the bus that's being purchased, is it new?
Actually, yes, and the city staff's been great in helping us kind of navigate this. So the city actually is purchasing a 24-passenger bus for the transit program. So we were able just to ride along on that bid. So is that what your question was?
Yeah, because I'm kind of going down the line of maintenance cost. I mean, if we're buying something used, we're going to probably run into maintenance
brand
costs a
new.
lot sooner than new.
And
Okay,
standard to things that you will already own.
okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Brooke or Carter? Okay, is everybody on board?
We appreciate you guys very much. It's been a great partnership with the city and look forward to good things to come. Thank you, Mayor.
Thanks for coming down, Brooke.
Mr. Mayor, just so you understand, we will be bringing forward an MOU that ultimately we'll be asking you to sign. So you'll have the opportunity to review a lot of these details that aren't totally fixed quite yet, but in turn should answer a lot of additional questions as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, moving along, Police Department Liquor Report.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, this is the time of year where you get to evaluate the performance of your license holders. And as you know, you have a wide range of license holders in this community, everything from a restaurant type liquor license all the way up to the gamut of having a 100% retail liquor license, as it were. We certainly have had years in the past where some of those holders have presented challenges to the community, and council has opted to visit with those license holders. You're familiar with a lot of those conversations, particularly those of you who have been on the council for some time now. Generally, what happens during the review period, the culminating outcome is a determination on your part here in just a few weeks as to whether or not you want to unilaterally renew all of these categories of licenses in mass. Again, sometimes you want to separate some of them to have additional conversations and so on. But nonetheless, the police report that you receive this time every year gives you sort of a gauge that you can use to determine if in fact other holders need to be visited with, or if there's some other homework that council would like staff to do in preparation for your determination of whether or not you want to renew all of the liquor licenses that you oversee and facilitate. Tonight is your opportunity to hear from the police chief and hear what their, the police department's experiences have been over the last review period, and you get to determine whether or not we have some homework to do or invitations to extend for your formal review, which comes up in just a couple weeks. Thank you.
Chief.
Mayor, Council, thank you for the opportunity to present this report to you. Overall, what you're going to hear from me is that there are no glaring aberrations to Council's desires and our public safety goals. We've made significant progress over the years in eradicating some of the ones that were more problematic to our public safety goals. In this particular case, I've tried to give you as much detail as I can. This one's a little bit more detailed. It offers you a comparison on how individual licensees have fared with their calls for service. As you go through this data, remember that the actual the listings of calls for service do not all, it's not just isolated to ones that were directly related to their purveying of alcohol. So it's a true recollection or a true accounting of just how often we have to go to that for the variety of reasons that they come to. So when you look at this data, there are none that rise to the level that the chief of police is coming to you and recommending that you have a chat with them. One of the things that I do want to point out is that statistical comparisons, again, are still tainted by the impact of the pandemic this year. So we're going on 2 years now that I would caution you from too much of statistical comparisons because there's just not enough normalcy in the things that we're doing. Everything that we have would be considered to be abnormal. So in the end, during our sting operations, we had 15 failures this year. That's slightly up from last year, but not so much that it would cause us concerns. I'm going from memory, I want to say that 2 of those were repeat offenders from last year's sting operations. This particular year, we started our operations a little bit earlier, and that first initial operation did not go well. There were 7 failures in one fell swoop on that. I think because our retailers were a little bit of anticipating, oh, they usually come around after Thanksgiving, and when we showed up before Thanksgiving, that didn't go just as well for us. So, but the sting operations or the compliance operations, generally speaking, most of our retailers are compliant. For statistical comparisons, the things that I would draw your attention to is that we are, and continuing into 2022, we are seeing more alcohol-related crashes, and the severity of those alcohol-related crashes are going up. In other words, more injuries, more property damage is occurring. And just in the last week, we've had 2 more DUI crashes that, people were injured and significant property damage. So that is one of the trends that we're looking at dealing with. A significant improvement. It was a 28% increase in the number of minors, persons that are 20 years of age or younger, in possession of alcohol. That's a 28% decrease. That's absolutely good news for our community. As you can see, DUI crashes were up 12%. That trend continues to grow in this particular year. I do mention in there that a couple of establishments fared much better, so much so that I wanted to publicly acknowledge them. The Gaslight Social has historically been an area that was of concern. This year they dropped in the number of police calls for service by approximately 74%. That's a great win for our public safety goals. And Second Street Liquor and Wine had an astounding reduction of 84% in the number of calls for service on there. So I just wanted to publicly acknowledge some of these retailers seem to be doing a much better job of partnering with the first responders to make our community a little bit safer. With that in mind, I would open it up to any questions that council may have.
Steve, Kathy, and then Lisa. And then Kyle.
The one question I had, Chief, is I noticed there were several in here that had what appeared to be significant alarm calls, which I'm assuming that's their burglar alarm system. And I was wondering, is there a point that something needs to be done to, hey guys, you need to fix your alarm, or how does that wind up working?
Mayor, Councilman, responding to false alarms is a significant drain of police resources, and frankly speaking, you've brought up a topic of concern. We've been discussing this at the command staff level. The command staff is kind of the police department is of the opinion that we've been given mixed signals on what level of enforcement council wants us to do. So right now, that is an area of concern. We would prefer that in our licensing and authorization of alarms in our community that we have a little bit more opportunity to deal with the ones that are chronic offenders right now. So when an alarm goes off, we have to respond. We want to encourage those people that have poorly installed alarms, or ones that are, if they have a sign hanging from the ceiling that when the air conditioner kicks on, it fires off the alarm. We want to mitigate that, but right now we don't have clear direction on what level of cooperation we can hope to get from those chronic offenders.
Okay, and as a follow-up, something that I did notice as well in your report, the office is listed twice. One under the O's as office, and the under the as the office. So I read your report. So, and by the way, it's the Fort, not the Ford, because just anyhow. Some of you that have been around council long enough know that I catch a lot of those things. Anyhow.
Lisa.
Thank you, Chief.
I did notice the alarm thing. So, but the one question is I know that we're talking about alcohol, but I'm just curious if you're seeing an uptick also with drug use and accidents along with alcohol?
Mayor, Councilwoman, I'm going to give you anecdotal opinion at this point. The presence of drugs in the system at the presence of a crash are much harder for us to detect Anecdotally, we would say yes. Our community has seen a recent influx of opiate, specifically fentanyl. That's a very powerful drug that definitely impairs a person's ability to drive. There's the increase in overdoses is apparent, and I think if you extrapolate that out to a certain percentage of people are falling victim to that, a certain percentage of those are going to be driving. It's much harder to be easily visible to us. When somebody is consumed a couple 6-packs of beer, there's a lot of signs of that. It's not the same for a lot of the different controlled substance categories of drugs.
Kyle.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Chief, for being here, for the information and pointing out some of the highlights of folks that are doing really well. I think that's important for us to acknowledge the people in our community that are really making an effort to try to reduce some of these numbers. I only have one question. I have faith that, if there were any folks in here that you thought worthy of mentioning, you would have already done so. But I did, as I was reading through it, one did just stand out to me, and that was the Ramada. I noticed they had about a 30% increase from last year, and just in general, had quite a few, almost twice as much as the Ramkota just down the street. Part of that was 27 citizen assists. I don't know exactly what that means, but I'd just be curious if you could give some more context to maybe that one in particular, specifically citizen arrests. What does that mean? Thank you.
Councilman, Mayor, Council, I'm going to try to be circumspect in how I respond to this. It is my opinion that the Ramada has undergone some repeated ownership and management changes, and I think anytime that happens, the proficiency of the staff may be hampered by that. In this particular case, without maligning that organization, they had some staff members that were not as aligned with our community goals as I would wish. When it comes to citizen assist, that can take a variety of, somebody just needs a ride because their car broken down. There's a variety of things here. I wouldn't want to draw too many conclusions on that. It could be a lot of things.
Vice Mayor.
I guess, Chief, just to follow up on the alarm, is that something that we need to maybe set for a work session agenda item to discuss whatever you need as far as the alarms go?
Mayor, Vice Mayor, I believe that the police department needs some guidance on what level of enforcement that we want to do to help reduce the wasted man hours and the response times. It's very easy to document how much money we spend on that. When you add the salary and benefits of the time involved, the wear and tear on our vehicles responding to that, on something that is preventable. I would like my officers to be able to go out and prevent crime instead of just documenting crime, and it's very hard to prevent crime if we're tied up because we have to go to these alarms. Even the chronic offenders may sometimes be the victim of a burglary, and we want to be able to respond to it. There may be an emergency. We need to go to it. But right now we're lacking the incentive to encourage alarm owners to stay compliant, to fix those problems that cause chronic false alarms. And I would ask that council consider putting that on a work agenda so that we could have direction on how council wants us to treat these business owners and our residential areas in the community.
All right, so follow up, Mr. Mayor and Carter, if we could maybe do that, add that onto a work session for discussion.
Mr. Mayor, if it's okay, can we go ahead and take a poll to make sure that's good to go?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was about. Is everybody okay with putting that on a work session? Talk about that? Yeah, you can go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you.
I think that when we do the work session, though, could you bring over some numbers about how much the cost is to send out a patrol to go look at those so that we have an idea of what costs are for the trip?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Jai.
Thank you. I don't know if these are ignorant questions, so apologies in advance if they are, but looking at the DUI figures here, Are these traced in terms of, or documented in terms of whether or not they're traced back to certain establishments or license holders, I should say? So that's the first question. The second is just, you mentioned the increasing DUIs. I'm just kind of curious, and you might not have the exact date range, but like over what time horizon has that trend been occurring? And I don't know, just curious about that.
So, Mayor, Councilwoman, I'll try to remember all of those questions. The trend rates that I'm comparing these to are over the last calendar year. However, for the last couple of years, last year we had a significant reduction in DUIs, but I believe that was a function of the pandemic and the early onset of that, reduced hours at many of our on-site establishments. Some of them were closed for a while. That it was a no-brainer that DUIs were going to go down. During that same time period, we did not see the same reduction in DUI-related crashes. So when it comes to analyzing the trends in our community, the enforcement of DUI offenses is relying upon an officer to be unobligated at another call so that they're free to see that and take action on it. So whether or not officers are available to make more DUI arrests is not really how we tell if we've got a problem. That's tracking how we respond to the problem. But we pay very close attention to the frequency of alcohol-involved crashes. When that goes up, that's how we know that we need to do more enforcement. We need to do more concentrated efforts to reduce that, because that is a number that occurs without police involvement. So if we could hire, and in fact we've hired, part of the reason why you see DUI arrests up this year is we've hired some people that's their passion, and so they're out making a difference and doing a really good job at that. So just a couple of officers can make a huge difference in that number. That's why we monitor the frequency and percentage of DUI crashes. And I'm sorry, what was the other question?
It was just in terms of your documentation, whether or not these specific incidents are traced back to whether or not there are license holders that seem to yield more.
Yes, Mayor, Councilwoman, that's exactly correct. And there has been some that were so egregious that the officers were, so what that takes is it takes a compliant offender. When we ask those questions, we need them to be compliant to be able to answer those questions so that we can do follow-up with that establishment. Obviously, chronic alcoholics, they can drink at home just as well as they can at an establishment. So, in fact, the city attorney has contacted me in the not-too-distant past of, this is a perfect example of one, do we know where that one originated? So we are looking at that. We do try to track that. We try to be aware of it. There has been times in the past during my tenure here where we were pointing back to a couple of specific establishments, and we're not seeing the same frequency of those. So, but we do check that, yes.
Steve Cathy.
You brought it up a minute ago about false alarms, and you mentioned residences, and I just wanted to bring this up so that when we go to our discussion about how do we deal with false alarms, do we have quite a few false alarms in the residences as well, or are they pretty well monitored, so to speak?
Mayor, Councilman, if you have an alarm system, it's supposed to be registered and licensed by the city. We do have false alarms at residences. The vast majority of the ones that really hit us hard are the bigger stores, the ones that have so much going on in them. So when you look at those, there are some that, and I'm sure that even the vice mayor could remember, particular locations that when that dispatch came out, you kind of rolled your eyes and took a sigh because you had to go to it, and then 1 out of 100 of them might actually be something. So, we do have residences that have false alarms, and the rules should apply to them also.
That was what I was curious about, so thank you very much.
Yeah, Bruce.
I'm just kind of curious where that's headed. Is it like something we would find people? I guess I have a an alarm system at my home, and the dog chewed up one of the things and brought the police to our home when we weren't there. So would that be a situation, which is a false alarm, of course, because the dog was doing it, but is that a situation where we would be fined for that? Is that what we're talking about here, or?
Yeah, go ahead, Chief.
Mayor, Councilman, that's an excellent question. We realize that things happen with alarms. And so generally speaking, most agencies, and I'm familiar with dozens and dozens across the nation, most agencies give you a leeway. During a calendar year, you get X amount of the dog ate my homework kind of things. And before we start looking at it, but after that, they start with a graduating fee of, you know, number 7's going to start, you know, we're going to ding you $20, but number 15 might be more. And so that when you have the corporation that refuses to fix their alarm system and they're on number 200, it starts actually accounting for the expenses that we are incurring as taxpayers, as citizens, as the police department. We need to use that funding appropriately to prevent crime, not respond to fake calls for crime.
That's just I think it's more than appropriate. I was just kind of curious where the ideology was headed. So it makes sense to me.
In almost every case, there's a window of, hey, we acknowledge that things happen during the calendar year, but once you get this one, we want you to fix those problems.
Sure.
Any other questions for the chief? All right. And it's just information only?
Mr. Mayor, indeed, it would be information for you to weigh in the balance of, you know, where you want to be on the renewals. This is a particularly better year than we've had in the past, where there really isn't a whole lot to report and, you know, things to be concerned about other than the general societal trends that we discussed here tonight. But yeah, my suggestion would be, unless you have some homework for us to follow up on, this really was meant to just give you some information.
Thank you. I don't think so.
And all park licenses are sold.
All right, moving on. Budget amendment number 2. Go ahead, Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Members of the council, this is, again, you're starting to get familiar with the amendment process, and as a newer council, if you will, this is really no different than what you've typically seen, meaning a large part of the amendment that you're considering, at least informally tonight, is dedicated to moving projects forward that weren't moved forward previously because of timing with respect to contracts and projects getting done and those kinds of things. You'll also see captured in here issues with regard to revenue coming in that we didn't anticipate during the budget prep period. You'll also see the capture of projects that we were given direction on relatively recently relative to the commencement of the budget again last May. A whole variety of things, but again, very, very common themes that you see in most amendments that we bring forward to you for your consideration. We do have a couple larger items, however, that we wanted to be sure you were aware of. The largest item, or at least one of the largest items that we wanted you to be aware of, is with respect to the new expenditure and project section that typically gathers you know, most of your colleagues' attention over the years. In this one, however, we have one for $3.9 million that we were not anticipating bringing forward until next budget year in the bail fill. And that is mostly with respect to creating a lining project for a new cell and closing down an existing cell. We were anticipating that happening in a year or two. Some recent direction from DEQ, however, has suggested we ought to put this forward sooner than later. I wanted you to be aware of what that how that impacts the bail fill fund, and we wanted to go through that with you tonight because you're familiar with the pro formas that we gave to you back in November. This has an immediate impact that you need to be aware of, however, albeit not something that would totally surprise you given the scope that this generally involves. We also have a rather large transfer coming out of capital with respect to the river project. This is with regard to the funds that we received in reimbursement form from BP. that we're bringing into the river fund. Nothing new there, not a new project, but it is a new revenue, as it were, that we've been waiting a reimbursement for. As for one of the other larger funding requests that we're asking for your help on, there is a fire truck expenditure that is in the neighborhood of $1.2 million. Again, this is a project that you've approved in the past. We are rolling it forward now versus what we've been able to do in the past. Not a new expense, not something you weren't aware of coming forward, but indeed, we didn't get it done in 21. We need to get it done in 22, and we're anticipating that being completed here soon. Beyond that, Mr. Mayor, members of the council, if there are specific questions that you have about this particular amendment, we'd be pleased to answer them. Otherwise, we could certainly go into the bail fill conversation to give you a more closer look to what that means.
I think Steve Cathy's got a question about that.
Yes. What I'm interested in is, since this is winding up moving up by 2 to 3 years, how is that going to wind up impacting the rates we just set and our reserves that we have coming up?
That sounds like a really good segue to me, Mr. Mayor, to bring up our exhibit. If that pleases the council, it gives me the door to walk through. Let's go ahead and bring that up if we could. Let's start with what council saw first and then move into what it is that we think this will do to our analysis, if we could. Could we blow that up? That's hard to. Yeah, okay.
On my phone, I forgot my keys, so I can't get into my locker. Oh, it's okay, but thank you very much.
So if we could move that chart down, you'll recognize this chart. And fortunately, we have Cindy here tonight that can go into, quite a bit of detail with you if you would like. You can see here that with the anticipation of this type of an expense, what we were anticipating moving forward through the scope of years that this covers, this analysis covers, the dramatic fall of the blue line toward the green line is because of this purchase in years out, right? A couple years out, a year out. I can't remember exactly what that was expected. Cindy, you may as well just come on up here. I'm sure we're going to have questions, particularly from Mr. Cathy, I bet. No, that's okay. That is totally okay. What you're likely going to see as we move this up from out years is that dip happening more dramatically sooner. So if we can go ahead and demonstrate that, Jill. That big of a cost coming forward sooner than later is going to have some impact. And that I think will put pressure maybe in the interim year for your consideration with respect to rates, when before we were suggesting that pressure wouldn't come for a couple years. So that really is the synopsis of what our problem is. The tail end of that blue line is dropping closer to where we're at right now versus being more profoundly up, if you will, in the previous slide. So notice that tail line closer to our current space on the timeline here. It's dropped dramatically. That's the difference. That's the activity you're looking for. And if you want that blue line to come further away from the end of the green line in the future, rates will probably need to be considered sooner than later. Again, we were anticipating coming to you for a rate increase in 2 years. We may need to consider a rate increase this coming December versus next December. And that's the basic punchline, if you will. I'd feel better, though, if Cindy could discuss why we need to consider this now versus 2 years down the road, if that's okay with you, Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, absolutely. Cindy?
Yeah. So the 2-year figure is when we're out of space. We were actually anticipating constructing in spring of '23, and you always construct about a year ahead of time because that minimum amount of space you need to be moving forward because of the slope construction. And right now where we're at, DEQ comes and inspects us every year, and where we're at on the cells 1 and 2, they're getting higher and higher. And the cells we're in are getting higher and higher, is we're up high right now, so we have a lot more litter. And it is harder to actually work with customers in a safe environment when you're up higher. And when you line a new cell, you can kind of put them down below. We have less litter, and it's a lot easier to control the customers coming in and out instead of on slopes that are really tall. So our staff suggested that we do this earlier this fiscal year so we get it started before summer this year, so we can have that space down below to prepare for customers while we're at the very steep ends placing the waste. So part of it's operational need. We need that extra space of that lined area to operate safely. And the other part is just environmental considerations. If we do it a little earlier, we have a little more control over litter and customer safety. So that's what we propose to Carter as we move it up the construction.
Bruce, and then I'll come to you, Steve, again.
How much of the pandemic, when everybody was home and just flooding you with stuff, exacerbated this? Without that, we would probably be okay, I'm guessing.
So interesting about the pandemic, Your Honor and council members, it switched where the garbage was coming from. Is all the restaurants were closed down and people weren't buying stuff, so we didn't have as much commercial garbage coming in, which hurt us financially because they pay us good money. Where now everybody's staying at home, they're doing yard work and projects they don't normally do, so a bunch of trash was coming in from the residential. Well, if you balance it, the trash didn't really change the volume, it was how it was coming in. So it really doesn't have any impact on the space, but it sure had some impact on our revenues.
Steve Catley.
And if I understood right initially, I thought we had a change in EPA. EPA really hasn't changed anything then. It's just a matter of safety and where we're placing our stuff. So we're still on the same playing field with the EPA then.
Yeah, Your Honor, Councilman, absolutely. I mean, we're not violating anything per se, but our DEQ in the state is very partnership oriented. And we do have a lot of litter problems with the wind, and the wind has been worse. So this will really help us control litter more. So it's more about best management practices than violations of environmental regulations.
Anybody else for Cindy?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carter?
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, just to give you a heads up on probably what we'll talk about here coming up in December. The proximity of the blue line to that green line is important at the end of our time frame that we hope to draw your attention to. In order to prepare for the next landfill that we've got to build and the next lining project and so on, you really need a lot more space between that blue line and the green line in, starting in 26, fiscal year 26. And so that will likely be what it is we gauge from you in terms of creating that savings account to get to where we were in 22 in order to accommodate this construction sooner than later. So be aware that disparity between the blue and the green is what we really need to consider so that we can be ready for the next construction project that'll likely come forward.
Amber and then Bruce.
Carter, on that note, can you remind me of what the timeline from this cell opening to the next cell opening is estimated to be? Or cell closing and opening, whatever is the easiest way to understand.
Sure, no problem, Mr. Mayor. The reality is we're hopeful that we can get more time out of these cells than what historically we have been. That's been sort of an initiative we've talked about with Cindy, and Cindy certainly is promoting these ideas as well so that we can allow that blue line to grow and develop more so over a longer period of time, obviously, and be ready in that regard. So I guess I would tailor that question a touch to say, what is it that we're seeing right now, Cindy, and what is it that we hope to accomplish if we're successful in leveraging these cells longer?
Your Honor, Councilwoman, excellent question, because when you first start out with a brand-new landfill, which was back in 2009, you don't have a lot of capacity that's efficient to begin with. So as you get up higher, it becomes more and more efficient. So Carter's absolutely right. We've been talking about these cells are going to become more and more efficient with time. So on average, we were lining cells every 5 years. So we're hoping that this one will last 7. And as we go to the next one, that'll be 8. And that it will continue to increase until we've met our maximum, capacity for efficiency with space. But definitely we're looking, I think it's 7. And I did explain to the city manager that our consultants are looking specifically at that question. Like, if we construct here, this is how much space we're going to get, and we have to estimate how much garbage. I mean, if we did something crazy like took Colorado's garbage, it would be different. But if we're getting the same waste that we've been getting, that this one will be in 7 years, and you're going to need that blue line to be here on that 7th year. Or, as I said, we always do it a year ahead.
Bruce.
Carter, my concern is we just raised rates not very long ago, and we beat up pretty good when we raise rates. And I guess my question is, why didn't we, it wasn't that long ago that we did this. So was this unforeseen at the time that we didn't make the adjustment then, as opposed to putting an increase on our constituents twice in a 12-month period?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, we knew that the possibility existed that we would have to bump this up sooner than later. And so we were certainly hoping that we wouldn't have to be in this position right now as it relates to constructing a cell sooner than we wanted to. The good news is there is, as you can see on this chart, there's still a lot of latitude for council to be very critical of any rates that you want to consider, even in November, which I would consider on an interim basis. I'm not suggesting that you have to do that, and certainly we still have a year to go, almost, of collecting data and seeing how our activity goes throughout the next summer and so on. So you may not see a recommendation in that regard, but what I will invite you to do, regardless, is be aware of the tolerance that you have with respect to starting to build for the next landfill, which again, in 26 may seem like a long time away. The reality is it isn't. And we took a lot of years to get to this point prior to construction. And I would suggest you're going to want to start that sooner than later anyway. May not be in November. I completely get that. But we certainly may not want to go 2 or 3 years without giving it real serious thought.
Did I mishear you then when you said we would probably be looking at a rate increase this December?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, I suggested that might be a possibility, but I'm not giving you a hard suggestion one way or the other right now.
I guess I want to go back to my previous question because I don't feel like it got answered. And I'm trying to put you on the fire a little bit.
Sure.
Because I remember when we chose to raise rates at the swimming pool for 25 cents and everybody was up in arms. Mm-hmm. And we just went through this. My question again is, why didn't we just include that in the raise that we just did, as opposed to going to our constituents twice in 1 year?
And I'll try again at saying, you may not hear a recommendation from us to go twice in a 12-month period. What I am suggesting, though, is that because this has been bumped up a year, that might have an impact with respect to what our costs are going to be and what they look like in 9 or 10 months from now. We did anticipate that there was a possibility that this construction would come sooner than we anticipated. Certainly we were hopeful we wouldn't have to be in this position at this point in time, But, it turns out that we probably should. Council could even tell us tonight that you don't accept this piece of the amendment and that indeed you'd rather stick to the original plan. I'm sure Cindy and her team would say, please don't do that. But the reality is, that is within your decision-making authority to say, yeah, let's wait a year, see what happens.
Well, if I may, I don't think we can wait a year. These projection and these lines are generally right on. We've learned that. And if there was any decision made tonight, it would almost be, we've got to do something now. We're going to end up behind the 8 ball, and then it's going to be a real mess. And so, we are really famous for kicking the can down the road sometimes, and I don't think this is a situation we can afford to do that. Would you concur?
Mr. Mayor, Councilman, we would not be bringing you this accelerated time frame if there weren't some concern with respect to the time we visited you in November and the time that we're visiting with you now that would suggest we need to do this sooner than we originally thought. I would tell you, though, that, again, this may not mean that you're going to have a hard ask from us in November for another rate increase. That's way too early to tell right now. Certainly with respect to you taking on this big of an expense sooner than we wanted to, it could go that way, but I would say don't go down that road yet.
Jai.
Thank you. So on that note, just in terms of projections, I've thought about this graph so many times since our last conversation, and I just still am perplexed by the meaning of that green line. It seems really misleading to me from a communications perspective in terms of what it is that we actually need in that fund. And it seems to me that operating above the green line sends the wrong message, and I'm just not sure what it's telling us, but I do remember our last conversation that we anticipate, if we're doing this accurately, that the graph kind of takes this sawtooth approach. And we did talk a bit about whether or not our decision to adjust rates might, in fact, be kicking the can down the road. So I think this is a conversation that actually we ought to have anticipated, and so therefore, looking forward, I think we also just need to think about what this specific graph is actually telling us about where we're at fiscally in that fund, because right now, the lines just aren't really telling me the story. I feel like I want to know. So just to consider in terms of the next conversation.
No problem. And Mr. Mayor, I'd be pleased to just remind council what that green line is really meant to represent, because I want you to continue to be thinking about it. But be thinking about it in a manner that really this message is all really intended to include. The green line really is only meant to give you a feel of a buffer zone that keeps you from using the black line as your point of demarcation for decision making. If you're using the black line for your point of decision making, your demarcation, your threshold to make, rate increase decisions and so on, you're talking about delving into reserves to operate your business. And we are suggesting that by just looking at the green line as a gauge to keep you away from, diving into reserves every time something happens, we believe that is a little more safe of an approach. It's because the distance between the black line and the red line are where you've got to be very, very concerned, because the closer you get to that red line, the closer you are to just flat broke. And it's typically much harder to repair business activity to come up from the red line than it is to come up from the black or the green. So it's just a buffer warning track area that we use for frame of reference.
You bet.
Okay, just in terms of my own reference then, thank you. That's helpful. I feel like I remember in the other funds that we were looking more at something in between the green and the black. Is that accurate? And so I think that's why I get confused on this one, because it's above, but maybe it doesn't matter, so I don't want to send us down the wrong conversation line here, but that's just where I get kind of confused from like understanding how we analyze this compared to our other funds.
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman Sutherland, I thank you for these questions, because I do not want to create confusion at all. But I would tell you that with respect to all of your funds, this particular fund is very, very dependent on a savings account strategy. Because at the end of the day, when you have a capital project that you need to do, they generally are going to be $3 to $5 million a pop. And so if you're not really wary of the relationship your blue line has to the green line, and definitely with regard to where your blue line is in relation to the black line, the bail fill will be most acutely problematic for you, because every time we jump into a new cell, we're going to count on spending $5 million, and you don't have it to spend when you get below the black line. And unfortunately, DEQ isn't incredibly tolerant when it comes to that point in time, and they're saying, crap, you got garbage flying all over Natrona County, you got to do something. That generally means do something now, you know. So probably more than most of your funds that you deal with and oversee and manage, the bail fill fund is really critical as it relates to where that blue line is in regards to your green and black lines, without a doubt. Hopefully not oversimplifying what it is that we're trying to discuss tonight. But
Lisa.
Is this the fund that we subsidize with the 1 cent for 250,000?
Mr. Mayor, Councilwoman, no, it's not. In fact, the bail fill and the refuse funds receive $0 from 1 cent. And she's demonstrating that for you right now. You're thinking of water and sewer. And sewer is the one that takes 250,000, somewhere in that
So
neighborhood.
I was just wondering, since we didn't budget this, where are we going to get the money to pay for this, since we were anticipating this to be a year or two down the road? So it's...
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Ingerbretson, excuse me. I speak sometimes quicker than I'm ready. That distance between the green line and the blue line in 22 is what is enabling you to absorb that expense sooner than later. If we were trending along the green line with the blue line real closely, we would have to talk about going into reserves to absorb this expense. But because you have built a buffer, a savings account for these kinds of projects in this fund, you are able to spend this money without seeing a dramatic impact in terms of the activity of the blue line, which really is, the ability for your reserves to absorb this expense. We knew it was coming. You built money for it, and so therefore we're able to take it on.
Amber.
Thank you. So Jai and I have discussed this, at length. I'm not particularly fond of this graph either, because I feel like it doesn't tell us everything we need to know. So realistically, if we were trending perfectly, just, mirroring right above the green line, like that fund would not be healthy and sufficient to cover the type of activity needed to be covered by that fund. So I think something that would help me a lot is if, let's say in 6 years from now, when we have to do this again, if there was like a star on a target amount that we need to have in that account to be able to cover, then we could be sure our line is trending towards that target point and in time for 6 years when we're going to need that money again to close and open another cell. I think that would clarify this a lot for me.
Mr. Mayor, I think that's a great idea. And what that would mean is we would take this timeline projection, if you will, 7 or 8 years down the road with a star towards the, the 5 million mark, if you will, and then you can see how that blue line needs to rebound and under what time frame that needs to happen. That's easy, no problem. We can do that, particularly for this fund, because this fund is very problematic in that regard. I like it.
Anybody else? Questions specifically? Okay. So Carter, you just need approval for us? I mean, we have to do it officially, so.
Mr. Mayor, if there were other questions with respect to the body of the amendment as a whole, we'd be happy to walk through some of those details for you. Otherwise, we just wanted you to be ready with this information because your approval actually comes next week. When in fact, I was thinking the beginning of March for some reason, but yeah, this is coming up.
Coming up soon, okay.
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks, Jill. Thanks, Cindy. Council committee assignments. So, just sitting and chatting a little bit, I know Fleur had sent out an email about interests, about the assignments that you do. I know I chatted with a couple of you privately, just based upon some of your information that you had given me about possibly staying on certain ones or maybe trying to be on a new one. Fleur's handing out here. Now, this isn't a final. I mean, if there is something that you might be interested in, contact me and let me know of something and we can talk. And I know some people have asked if maybe we can, somebody might want to trade or do something. And I have approached some people on the council and asked them, and some said they were good. Some said they wanted to be on other boards. So we did that. We had that conversation. But I want to just have this and open it up and have a conversation to see where everybody's at and see how people are feeling about certain things. I don't know what else we need to talk about, Fleur.
Your Honor, members of council. So I just handed out the sheet that we updated based on what you all told me of what you'd like to stay on or move off of. Mayor, I think, went over it all, and any changes I was given I put on there. So I think right now it's just if y'all have any changes you would like to see or if you want to talk about it, we're happy to take those down and switch them up. So.
Anybody? Kyle, I know you had some comments.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll reach out to you privately about some of the other questions I had, but I really like knowing what's going on in these commissions and boards, and I noticed some of them, I really appreciate the minutes being in our information packets, is where I'm going with this, and I noticed some of these, I don't recall ever reading anything about them. And so I was just curious, could we, I imagine they're taking minutes, and so is there any way to get those minutes into our information packets? That's my question, and then my follow-up statement would just be, I would like, my colleagues that are going to these meetings, I personally appreciate updates about what's going on and what they're talking about and stuff, so that's just my own personal, I really like hearing what's going on in all these groups, so thank you.
Any other comments? Yeah, Bruce.
So, Mayor met with me privately on one of the boards I was on, which I appreciate him being straightforward with me. So, Ray, thank you for that.
Yep.
But I do want to make a public comment concerning that particular board, because I've raised a little bit of hell over the Contractor Licensing and Appeals Board. And for whatever reason, it keeps getting misconstrued, and it's really starting to irritate me. This was never, for me, about contractors doing shoddy work or overcharging people or anything else. That was never what this was about. What it was about, and it's coming up next week, so I'm just giving you a precursor to what's coming, because although I will not be a liaison to that board, I am not going to let those constituents down that came to me and asked me to pick up this fight, and I believe in it. That's why I'm doing it. This is about licensed contractors and unlicensed contractors circumventing the rules to benefit themselves by not getting proper permitting or not having their work properly inspected. And there's an older couple in town who really took it in the shorts, and now they can't sell their home. They're on a limited budget, and we just good old boyed them and gave them the permit and passed it on through, because that's what we do. And I am fighting against that. I'm going to continue to fight against that until there are some regulations in place to protect the people in our community. That's what it's always been about for me. I don't know how it got misconstrued, but some of those people on the board are really irritated with me because I'm bucking the system, I'm bucking the trend, and so they've asked to have me removed off the board, which is just fine. But I'm not letting go of that fight. I won't do it. And next week when we get more involved in it, and I can actually give you the actual situations where some of our people have literally been screwed over by our own system. And that's why I'm pushing for it to change. And it'll be up to you guys to decide if you want to do that or not, but at least I'll be able to go to sleep at night and say, hey, I fought for you, here's what it is. But sometimes when we're on these boards, it is very tough, and not everybody knows what's going on in those meetings and those boards. And, you know, for me, it's more important that the right thing is being done than being able to shake the hand or pat the back of the guy next to me. And I'm not gonna lie, it pisses me off a little bit that they can just say, oh, Nell's not going along with the status quo, let's get him booted off this board. And that's really irritating to me. And I just wanted to say it publicly, and so that's all I have. I'm not mad at you at all. You did what you needed to do, and I appreciate you coming to me, but I don't like this good old boy stuff. And I've never been one of those to play them games, and so I guess they better batten down the hatches because I'm coming, at least for that. So, thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Any other comments? The only other thing that I wanted to mention, I know it's a time commitment. I know we go through this every year. I know there are times I miss meetings. I know that there are times I try to do a good job of contacting who's in charge to let them know I can't make it or that I follow up. But it's really, really important with some of these. Some of them are voting, and so some of them are really super important. And so I guess I would ask council to continue to exercise work and making sure you're coming to those boards. To a lot of people, it's really important. And they really, really appreciate council members being there and being able to do that. And so if for some reason a board that you're on, or even as a liaison, and you're just feeling like you can't make it, contact me and just be, hey, like, can we see if I can switch and be able to do that? And I'd be more than willing to work with you. So, yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
Could you, just because we have so many new members and it was confusing for some of us, could you just explain what our actual job as a council liaison is?
Sure. So generally, and I'll have either Fleur or Carter back me up on this. So as a liaison, you basically are just a representative from council to go there to gather information, represent city council on that, whatever it may be, a board, could be a nonprofit, whatever it may be. And so generally as a liaison, very rarely, you're not a voting member. Generally you don't get invited too often to the executive sessions if it's a nonprofit and so forth. Then there are sometimes like Economic Development Joint Powers Board, the AMICO Joint Powers Board, the Regional Board, Joint Powers Board, and a couple others. You're actually a voting member on that, and you vote as a board member. And so some of them are just liaisons, and some of them where you just kind of go there to gather information, kind of like what Kyle was saying, that it's an opportunity for us to come back and say, oh, hey, just wanted to report on this board. This is what they're doing and so forth. And so I feel both are equally critical. I know that the voting is a little bit more in the sense because you're passing some types of legislation to an extent, depending upon what you're doing. So is that effective? Does that answer your question too, Lisa, a little bit?
It does. And then how does an organization have a council liaison? Because I had an organization ask me about that. And
yeah, that's a good question.
Consent money, I'm not sure how all of this.
Carter, how does the liaison work? Is it a request from an agency? Because I know we've had other agencies that we've kind of stopped going to as liaisons. Could you maybe expound on that just a little bit?
You know, Mr. Mayor, council member, that certainly has been a question that has been in flux over the years. Certainly 5 years ago, there were a vast amount of committees and boards and so on that council was assigned to, and your list was, 10 deep with each of you and so on. I may be exaggerating a touch, but there was a conscientious decision made by that council of the day to winnow those assignments to a more manageable number for each of the participants, all of you. The reality is council gets to decide, particularly if a group is interested in having an appointee, if you will, to participate at your leisure. So if indeed, for example, the Nicolason, we got a call from them recently, And, their board was kind of wondering, well, what happened to our council appointee? 6 or 7 years ago, we had a member attend our meetings regularly. If council would decide that upon an inquiry like that, or upon a request of a nature that would be similar to that, you'd like to start sending people again, or would initiate a relationship of that nature, you get to determine whether or not that's something you want to do. And I would suggest that would be by majority vote of this group to make that happen. In some cases, boards and entities aren't interested in having a council appointee. And in some cases, you're going to say, because they're getting funding, oh no, we want you to have an appointee. And that will be contingent upon the funding we give you. I've seen that happen as well. We don't have that situation right now where you're saying, oh yes, we're going to have somebody there if you want this funding. But you may decide you want to go down that road, depending on the group that's coming forward and the requests that they're making. That's up to you as well, particularly if city funding is in the balance. But there's a number of ways that these things can happen. Sometimes it's by request, sometimes it's by fiat, and sometimes it's just because you have a mutual interest that you want to help each other be successful. I hope that helps.
Hey, Fleur, can we make an adjustment? And so the health department reached out and said they would like to have Steve continue on that.
Okay, yeah, that was just one that you had mentioned in our,
Yep. So if you would go ahead and put Steve back as the liaison or the member, that would be perfect. Yep. Yeah, Jay.
So just following up on what you said in terms of process there, was there a question in there about, like, if you receive a call, the process by which we determine whether or not we'd want to be a part of that, or is that not a decision point? You just said, like, somebody had called and that you would recommend that by majority, we decide whether or not we'd want a council member to be there. So is that a conversation we need to have?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, Madam Councilmember, it was more of an inquiry. It wasn't a formal request. And so if indeed they were adamant, wow, we really want to have a council person, all they can really do is request, and then you get to decide if you want to fulfill that request. But to my understanding, that was really just an inquiry more than anything.
So if that happens, you'll just bring it to us then?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You betcha.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, Lisa.
Who do they request a council liaison to?
It would be this body. So if there is a,
They came to me and said, hey, could we get a council liaison? Then I bring it to Fleur? Do I tell Ray, you?
my suggestion, Mr. Mayor, if I may, would be that board make a formal request, and that should really be done in writing to the mayor. And in that circumstance, the mayor would bring it to this group, and I would suggest you even invite that group in and have a conversation.
Yeah, sometimes in boards, we'll approach certain members and just say, hey, can we, be interested in having you or be interested in this? And so that's the case that happens sometimes, and just have that conversation. So I'll have a private conversation with you. We can do that. I know Kyle has a couple interests and so forth that he can talk to me too. So, Kyle.
Well, I was just going to say whether an organization has a dedicated liaison or not. I've attended several board meetings that was just kind of on a one-time basis. They structured the meeting in a sense that allowed me to just become educated and informed about what they're doing. And so to any organizations out there that would like council just be more aware of their activities, but maybe not necessarily have a dedicated liaison, I would just say, email us, and I'm sure my colleagues would take up invites as well to just come on a one-time basis just to hear what's going on, and then hopefully report back to us as a council about that organization's activities.
Bruce.
Two questions. One is actually piggybacking on Kyle. If we are to be reached out and they say, we're not necessarily looking for a liaison, but we'd like you to attend our meeting, is that something we should clear with this council before we do so? Or do we have the latitude to just go and partake in the meeting like we were asked to? What's the protocol for that?
I mean, the way I would handle is I would just contact whoever the liaison is and just say.
No, this would be a non-liaison.
Oh, a non-liaison board.
Said, hey, we'd like you to come and, see what we do, and is that something I need to clear with council, or do we have the protocol to just go and partake? Or-
Carter, what do you think? I don't think so, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, Councilman, if you're being invited to come and sit in and listen to a group that may be concerned that you or the council isn't aware of what they do and it's sort of a one-time thing, I've never seen it where that particular council person has had to run it by the group as a whole. I would say go and enjoy the meeting and gather information. And if there's something you can bring back to the council, I bet your colleagues would appreciate that.
Maybe do it at council around the table or something.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And then my last question was, I've been on the airline advisory board since I've been on council, and I've never been contacted, which I found rather strange considering the struggles Delta's had and the funding from the county and all that. I would have thought there would have been some reaching out at some point. So I don't know if, I just thought I better throw that out there because with all the struggles they've been having lately and asking for funding and thing, I would certainly think that committee should have met at some point. Airline Advisory Committee, so.
Yeah, I think the meet as needed is a kind of a nuance when, because you never know, because it could go a year without meeting. Sure. I think, because I've been on some of those as well, where you're on a board or a liaison or whatever, and it says meet as needed, and you never hear from them. So you just kind of sit back. So, yeah, go ahead, Carter, if you have other thoughts.
Mr. Mayor, thank you for bringing that up, Councilman. That may be reason to not include groups like that on your list, because if in fact they don't need your participation, and we haven't seen activity for a couple years running, you may want to winnow your list even further by groups like that.
And it looks good on my list because it makes me look like I'm participating as much as everybody else, but it really, I know, but it seems fruitless. So I
just want to be removed from that. You can if you want.
Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that, or should we have anybody on it at all? I guess is the question.
Exactly.
Yeah. Steve.
But I guess as a follow-up to that, I know that looking down this list earlier, I believe it's Jai that might be on the alcohol dealers committee, and I know that they meet, but I also know that the people that are in charge of that don't necessarily reach out. Probably once Kristen left, it was kind of out of sight, out of mind. So some of these that we haven't heard anything from, we should probably reach back out to them and just make sure there's not meetings taking place that we're missing.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Who would I talk to about who's on this committee or who I should contact to find out if they're actually meeting? And if they're not, maybe I could broach them and say, are you okay if we remove that from our list? Either way. So, but who would be a good contact for that? Do you know, Carter, by chance?
Mr. Mayor, I would suggest that's probably Mr. Januska, but why don't we do just a touch of homework to make sure we know who that is and offer that to you.
Yeah, if you could shoot me an email, I'll be happy to reach out to him.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
While we're on the same vein, can we reach out to alcohol dealers too? Just to touch base? Just so we can get some clarification for Jai and get more work for Jai. So if you have any other questions or comments or concerns about something, and you're worried about it, just let me know. Holler at me or holler at Fleur. We can kind of get something set up too. So I appreciate everybody's hard work, and we'll continue on. So thank you. Mr. Manager, anything on agenda review?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple things to bring up for your attention. The public hearing and the decision necessary for the budget amendment number 2 actually takes place next week. And so in case I confused the dates, I wanted you to be aware of that. Accordingly, the decision with respect to liquor license renewals also takes place next week. And again, I may have confused the dates in my own mind and transferred that confusion to you. I apologize if indeed I did do that. But those two important decision-making processes will take place next week during your regular business meeting. We also talked about the purchase of a transit bus That also is taking place next week, your opportunity to consider that. And just so you know, that pricing that's associated with that purchase, which is in the neighborhood of $187,000, we were anticipating that price to go up here very soon. And so in conversation with them, they did agree to withhold the purchase of that van for Visit Casper at the same price, despite when it is that we actually get the MOU done and can make that purchase happen. Probably the purchase agreement to make that happen. So they very graciously agreed to hold that same price for that van purchase, and we're not up against that, pricing crunch that we often see for bigger purchases like fire apparatus and so on. But it will be the exact same bus, if you're wondering. One of the other things that I wanted to give you just as by way of a heads up, police vehicles are becoming a real purchase you need to consider with some real detail here. Some 5-6 years ago, when the city got into the 1-to-1 program, which is where each police officer is assigned a marked unit, that was almost like a balloon purchase. We had funding at the time to make one massive purchase, which means in 5 or 6 years, when those cars come up for obsolescence because of their use and their expense to maintain them and so on, you need to consider another balloon payment, if you will, to get that fleet back up to snuff. Well, guess what? We are at that point in time. And as a matter of fact, this coming funding cycle, this new budget, you're going to be asked to make a big purchase with regard to police vehicles. Fortunately, not all at once, like we did back in 13, 14, 15, whatever that time period was. But indeed, phasing in still has a deeper commitment than you would normally see with the purchase of police vehicles. And so that's just a heads up, a preview, if you will, to some of the conversation that we're going to have very soon as it relates to capital, because rolling stock is a big part of capital. This purchase is not one of those, but nonetheless, like I said, just an opportunity to give you a heads up. As we move through the grid document here, on the 22nd, we have a number of issues that we're looking forward to your input and feedback and direction on. The 22nd is when the conversation with respect to licensed contractors comes up. And as Mr. Nell indicated, there will be kind of a primer meeting with some of our contracting board and Mr. Nell, and I believe Councilwoman Ingebretson may be involved in that as well. We also have a real critical conversation scheduled with the Ford Wyoming Center. As you are all aware, we have that agreement to be considered for renewal. We're hoping to bring the first draft proposal to you in this meeting, the 22nd, to continue those conversations and maybe get some real definitive homework from all of you in regards to that proposal. You'll have a follow-up conversation with respect to I-25 and Center Street. This is the design discussion that we need to have with you, part 2, if you will. Certainly we can have a part 3 as well, but as you might imagine, WYDOT is interested in seeing what our cooperative agreement is going to look like, and this information will be really helpful for that eventual outcome. We are going to talk to you about some resolution with respect to the cemetery, and more particularly about the fees associated with the cemetery. Some of you have had questions about gambling and what it looks like in our community and how, in fact, all these establishments come into being. We'll have that conversation coming up on the 22nd as well. Furthermore, I would direct your attention to the very back page where you can see sort of the layout for our horizon as it relates to meetings we see on the near horizon, and some are actually on the further horizon as well. But nonetheless, if you don't see topics on that list that you haven't seen docketed yet or whatever, this would be your opportunity to evaluate that list and make sure items of concern to you are brought forward to your group so we can get them on this future agenda portion. And that's all I have, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Yeah, you bet, Bruce.
Thanks. 2 questions. One, the police vehicle The police vehicle purchase that'll be coming up soon.
Right.
We have 1 cent funding for that available, is that correct?
Well, Mr. Mayor, Councilman, that really is the challenge of the question. You know, where you think the most appropriate funding would be to tackle this. We certainly will bring forward a recommendation that will fund the first phase of that purchase. And we hope to phase that purchase in over the next 2 or 3 years. So it's not all in 1 year like we did when we got into the program. But yes, we will attach with it a funding recommendation. It's up to you to determine whether or not you're, okay with that.
Understood. And then my last question would be, the fact that I'm no longer a liaison on the Contractor Licensing and Appeals Board, is it appropriate for me to still attend that meeting on the 10th, I believe? Or would you prefer that I do not go to that?
Mr. Mayor.
On the 15th, excuse me.
The 15th. I think you're right. The 15th, I think, is when it is. As far as I'm concerned, being the outgoing member of that board, you have some information to bear that would probably help the conversation. So my opinion would be that you should attend. And so I would ask that you would, if it's okay with
I'm happy to.
your colleagues.
I don't want to cross any lines, so.
You bet.
Wouldn't it be on the 17th?
It's on the 15th, actually. I have it in my calendar. It's Lisa and I. You wouldn't be a part of that.
The 15th is a normal council meeting.
Yeah, it's that morning.
Oh, okay.
Lisa?
I'm going to extend an apology. It's February 22nd. I will not be here. I have tried everything to get out of, but I absolutely cannot miss this appointment, and so I will not be here. But I will watch it on YouTube, but I will not be able to contribute.
Okay.
Kyle?
Thank you, Mayor. To dovetail from Councilmember Nell's inquiry about the police vehicles earlier, I've spoken with the chief about this on an individual level, and regrettably, I've forgotten many of the details. And I realize this is too quickly to speak to him before our meeting next week, but I would love, at some point in the future, to have a discussion about how that program has gone, this one-to-one program. From what I understand, it was originally implemented to decrease crime in the neighborhoods of that officers lived or something. I guess I don't know exactly, but I'd love to hear whether we think that program has had the impact that it was supposed to have when it started, and then also just, is that direction that the council has given to the chief, something that he has to abide by, or does he have flexibility in his budget to use money how he'd wish? I would just like to know more about that program, and so if we could add it to a future work session or something, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Is council okay with adding that to the work session?
My only question would be, could it be added by any chance before the discussion on the police vehicles comes up, so that we have, so that we have the information beforehand? It would only make sense.
Is that a possibility, Carter, to get it on a work session before that?
Mr. Mayor, I think it's absolutely a possibility. You betcha.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other agenda review items? Okay, legislative review. I know from last week.
Mr. Mayor, members of the council, I really appreciate all of you attending the legislative dinner almost a week ago now. I think the feedback and the follow-up was very positive and helpful and everything else. So thank you for dedicating your time and coming out to that. We appreciate it. And again, I think that networking is probably as important as potentially seeing bills that we like get passed, ultimately. So thanks for taking that time and moving forward in that direction. In that regard, I would like to have a conversation with council about a couple of the bills that are sort of surfacing right now and gaining some traction. And so while I'm not ready to tackle that this evening, I would ask that you allow me to bring some of those forward in the next opportunity that we have and get your take and make sure we're not getting ahead of this council. So with that, that's all I have to report.
Okay. Anybody on legislative review? All right, council around the table. We'll start with Amber.
Thank you very much. I just One note on that legislative dinner, I just wanted to say thank you to Carter for advocating on behalf of the community, did a great job representing a lot of really important elements to our folks who are going to be heading down to legislative session here next month. So thank you for your work putting that presentation together. I think it was really showed well on the city. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bruce?
Wyoming Cowboy basketball, men's basketball is ranked number 26 in the country. They are 1 win away from cracking the top 25. They are 19-3. So I don't know what's going on down in Laramie, but our athletic programs seem to be excelling quite well. So other than that, Logan Wilson's playing Sunday, our very own Natrona County Casper boy in the Super Bowl. So if football's your thing, you'll get an opportunity to root on a hometown boy in that. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Jai?
Nothing for me tonight.
Steve Cathy?
I owe an apology to the chief. The Ford and Fort was not in your report. It was in Jill's report. On page 2 of the budget amendment, you have the $183,000 for the elevator at the Fort Wyoming Center. So
Please correct that, Jill.
I apologize
Thank
to
you.
you, Chief. So thank you very much. That was all I had.
Sean? Kyle?
I apologize. I have a lot this evening. I'll try to be quick about it, though. I did want to agree with Councilwoman Pollack about the legislative dinner. Thank you to Carter for doing such a great job presenting, educating our local legislators about the priorities the city would like to see in this next session. And thanks to the city staff. I know there was, a handful of you guys that had to be present and helped organize it and everything. Thanks to the other council members that showed up, and thanks to all the legislators for taking the time as well. I had the opportunity to speak at St. Anthony's School Career Day last Friday. I got to speak to 4th graders and middle schoolers about city government, as well as answer lots of questions. So I wanted to thank them for that opportunity. I always enjoy doing that. Had a Casper Youth Council meeting this last Sunday. We discussed opportunities for them to help the city educate and inform citizens through the use of social media, especially media consumed by citizens their age. I think they got a better handle on it than most of us. And so hopefully there's some opportunity to leverage Casper Youth Council and some of the folks on their team to help us do a better job educating, informing citizens, especially the younger ones that are very hard for us to reach. Also Sunday, I went to the 307 Skate Park Public Forum. It was good to see lots of passionate younger community members show up. It was a very young demographic, which I was excited to see. They have a very ambitious and exciting vision that includes the creation of a multi-use venue for indoor skating of all different types, laundry services, food pantry, art closet, and other resources for teens. It's still in its early stages, but they're establishing committees to help with fundraising, construction and design, marketing. So if that's something that interests you, their vision, or if you have resources that you could lend to them, I'd encourage you to get a hold of them on Facebook or through email. I'm also happy to make that connection. And then I guess lastly, I wanted to thank Carter for some additional information he sent out to us as council last week in regards to some of the concerns that were brought to us regarding the transit program, the assist program. And so I hope I'm not stepping on any toes or anything like that, but I did find some of that information very helpful for me as I was forming my opinion. So I just wanted to share a couple of the keynotes. So since we took over operations, the city, I didn't have nothing to do with it other than making casting a couple votes. But since the city took over operation May of last year, we have increased by approximately 30 rides a day, equating to an average of 750 rides a week, 750 additional rides per week that were not being offered before May, if I understood that correctly. We currently serve 11 dialysis riders 3 times a week for 66 trips round trip. And obviously there's a couple different facilities that offer those services in town, and seems to be that our transit system works more efficiently with some of those facilities than other ones, and this can be due to passengers, potentially just having a hard time getting to their, being at the bus stop on time, both to and from. We've extended hours of operation to accommodate some dialysis patients who need to make earlier or later treatments. When the office is going to be closed for holidays, the city releases press releases. I believe one went out today, about the next upcoming holiday. And they also reach out to the dialysis offices beforehand to let them know they're going to be closed as well. So there was just a lot of helpful information in that update, but I think it's just important for residents to know. I know we got a little bit of grief for it last week, but since the cities took over operations, we've upgraded and enhanced the fleet. We've increased the budget. We have extended the hours. We've not changed the routes. And so I guess I would just ask for residents, citizens, patience and grace, as well as the gals that spoke last week. I'm sure some of those concerns are legitimate, and I think there's always room to be doing things better. And so I'd like to have us continue exploring how we, make these services better. But on the other side of the coin, I think our city staff does a really good job carrying out their services. Nearly all of the drivers for the Assist program were the drivers for CATSI. There's some confusion in the community about, it seems like there's a totally different crew. It's almost entirely the same crew. And from what I hear, those drivers are very dedicated to their clients. They are baking them food and doing things outside of their, work duties. And so I just, I felt bad. I obviously don't like hearing about folks having a hard time getting to dialysis, so I'd love to see what we can do to improve that. But I also felt a bit bad for the drivers. I felt like they were getting judged a bit too harshly, and just wanted to ask for folks to, I guess maybe not be as reactive. Sometimes when some of those concerns are brought to our attention, we're, as the mayor suggested, we're going to talk about it and hopefully do what we can to fix it. But that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Lisa.
What Kyle said.
Vice Mayor.
The only thing I have to add, Saturday night, Councilwoman Sutherland and Councilman Kathy and myself attended Boys and Girls Club event. And first numbers I saw come in, I don't know what the official number was, but I know it was over 800,000 it was raised that night. So probably the biggest amount I've seen yet come out of it. So good night.
I think everything's been said, so we'll adjourn. Thanks. Have a good night, everybody.